Hi, I'm Jeff Porcaro. On behalf of Starlix and myself, I'd like to welcome you to what I think is going to be a very informative and fun session. I intend on covering the next 50 minutes or so what I think to be the two basic grooves in contemporary music. That is, your straight 8th and 16th note groove and your shuffle groove, which is derived from triplets. We also will be covering how I construct my patterns, some technique involved, and some exercises that may be helpful to you as you develop. So why don't we begin with the straight 8th groove. Now, when I come up with a pattern for a new song that I've heard for the first time, I pay close attention to the bass part, any vocal that's there, meaning really paying attention to the phrasing of the vocalist, and that pretty much will dictate the time and the groove. Not only the bass part, but maybe rhythmically what the keyboards or guitar are playing. To give you an example of this, when I did the Steely Dan tune FM, it was kind of a groove basically that went like this. Boom, 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 boom. So when I first heard that, the first thing I did was to play 16ths on the hi-hat, and it was something like this. Immediately I didn't like that. I thought it was just a bit too busy. It made the groove just too stiff and didn't have that snaky feeling when I just heard the guys playing it by themselves. So I went to 8th notes, and it would be something like this. Now, coming up with that pattern, I want to point out that it's important. When I played just the 8th notes on the hi-hat, it wasn't like I just played them the same dynamic, real stiff. I put kind of an interlope to it. Its own inner dynamic, up and down. And that helped with the groove. So that's basically what I do when I'm listening to most patterns, is think of all avenues, whether it be 16ths, some 16ths and 8ths, or 8th notes, and then play with the inner balance, the inner dynamic of those within the bar. In keeping with the topic of the hi-hat and the dynamics within the beat, I like to practice little hi-hat exercises. That is, playing 8th notes, adding in 16th notes, and different variations of accents and dynamics. For instance, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now accent quarter notes, half notes, then I'll start adding 16th notes, and I'll turn, it'll be adding a 16th note, or now, the reason I do these little exercises with the 8th notes and 16ths and all the variations, because it's helpful for me when I'm developing drum beats for songs. And I like to practice, for instance, playing 1 and 3 on the bass drum, 2 and 4 on the snare drum, and finding out what these different figures, the different places I put 16th notes or 8th notes, does to the lope or the feel. For instance, now's a good time, I think, to talk about stick technique, how I hold my sticks. I use match grip, and I hold it with the fulcrum between the first joint and my index finger, the top joint, and the meat of my thumb here. Here's my fulcrum with the sticks wrapped around. I think it's good that you investigate your technique and work on that. I do snap-ups to develop the wrist and the arm. And the reason I mention that, it's really good, I think this technique, these kind of chops are good to execute sixteenths. Now, there's two ways to play sixteenths, and it depends on the tempo, but there's the hand-to-hand method, the alternate groove, alternating stroke method of doing sixteenths. 1 E-enda, 2 E-enda, 3 E-enda, 4 E-enda. I like the single-handed method because it's a lot smoother feel, it coming from one wrist and hand here. The reason I say so, the more you develop it, it helps with the execution of sixteenths and up-tempo things. For instance, a Mike McDonald record I keep forgetting. I tried doing the alternating stroke method of doing sixteenths, and it sounded just too stiff and staccato for me. To give you an example. Compared to let's continue with these 16th note patterns. We'll keep 16th notes going on our right hand, but this time let's develop the bass drum. Try different patterns on your bass drum, and once you come with a couple that you feel comfortable with, make 2-bar phrases out of these patterns and rehearse those several times. I'll give you a couple examples. Now's a good time to get into bass drum technique. At least how I developed mine goes back to when I was a young kid, first learning to play drums. I couldn't reach my dad's pedal, so I play with my toes, basically, and the ball of my foot. And I guess you could say I dance on the pedals. And I like to slide up into my pedal when I'm doing some fast stuff. To give you an example. I slide. So that's how I go about playing my bass drum. It's the toe and ball method. Now, if we can continue with the 16th notes, I want to get into one of my favorite grooves, and that's a samba type feeling, or variations of a samba feeling. Samba feeling being this. Now what I'm playing is, it's 8th notes and 16ths on the hi-hat, and I'm opening the hi-hat on quarter notes, and closing them on the 8th notes. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now the bass drum pattern I'm going to play with the hi-hat pattern is a dotted 8th note and a 16th. Combining the two with the backbeats on 2 and 4, you have the reason I like this beat is because it's a very versatile beat, at least for me, to be used in the traditional 2 and 4 like I just demonstrated, and also in a halftime like this. Now that we've gone over the 8th note and 16th note grooves, especially the latter with the samba feel, I'd like to demonstrate on a variation of a Toto tune from the last album how I came up with the beat. So what I'll ask Mike and David to do is play a variation of that tune, and I will explain what I heard and how I came up with the pattern I did. Gentlemen? So the obvious beat that you may think of coming up with that would be the traditional backbeat on 2 and 4, for example. 1, 2, 3. Now, just for fun's sake, when I always hear a tune, like I said earlier in the tape, I like to think of all the variations of that groove that would fit in to leave space and for something unique. So when I first heard the groove, I was thinking of that King Solomon's Mine type thing, where I wanted the backbeat, the beats to be much more spread out, so the grooves to be much more halftime feeling. And it was more something like this. 1, 2, 1, 2. Guys, can we play a taste of that with me demonstrating just this simple thing? 1, 2, 3, 4. Now that I've established the groove of the song, it being the halftime groove with the tom-toms leading me into the third beat, it's time to fill out the rest of the bar. So if you refer to the back of the booklet, there's a snare drum solo written out. And within that snare drum solo, you'll notice there's a paradiddle starting on the second beat and a paradiddle-diddle starting on the and of 3. And it should sound something like this. I'll play it on the hi-hat. Now notice how I'm accenting on 1 and 3, the third beat being the snare drum, and there's a little ghost note. So you notice now when I just did that exercise, I really was laying the accents on 1 and 3. The third accent will land on the snare, and there'll be a ghost note, a 16-note ghost note, right after that third beat on the snare. Now what I'll do is, after you get comfortable with the exercise, bring it over to the drums and orchestrate that pattern on the toms, the rim, cymbals, whatever. And it should sound something like this. 1,